Now, I've done this presentation before, and again, I'm going to give you one last warning on the presentation that if you are easily offended, you probably shouldn't be here. But if you're easily offended or are bothered by the idea of sex and the supernatural, this may not be the best presentation for you. Just so you're aware of that going into it, we do like to make sure that people know that it's a touchy presentation sometimes. But so to speak, I gotta turn this on here. Okay. Before I get started though with the presentation, I had a couple of questions that I wanted to ask. How many people here, and I can see you well enough, raise your hands. How many people here believe in ghosts? I'm going to guess it's going to be the majority. You are at a ghost conference. If not, you wandered into the wrong room somehow. Okay, how many people here in the room have ever, or believe they have actually seen a ghost? There's still quite a few hands. But here's one that usually stumps the crowds when I do this. How many people here in the room have ever had sex with a ghost? Just one hand. Okay, all right, so you've had sex with a ghost. I've never had anybody actually say that before, that they've actually had that. So what was it like? Tell me what the experience was like having sex with a ghost. Yeah. Oh. Lynn and I have been working on that for 6 months, believe it or not. It's an old joke, but it was funny, and I mentioned it to Lynn, and so we've been cooking that up for a while. Here's the thing. There's a reason why I did that joke at the beginning of this presentation. Now, most of the time, when those of you who have seen me speak before, most of you who have seen me do this know that whenever I speak, my presentations are usually pretty, with a lot of jokes. Because it's nothing's fun if you take it too seriously. And I've tried to make this presentation funny, and there's just no way to do it. What should be when you hear it, when you hear the title and what it's about, Sex and the Supernatural, people giggle and they wonder exactly what I'm going to be talking about. But I wrote a book called Sex and the Supernatural, which turned out to be the fastest selling book ever in the history of our company. It's also the fastest selling book in the history of the conference because we sold out of everything we had last night. But I think the title was what got people, and I think the title gets people when they hear it coming as a presentation as well. The problem is that I discovered with the book and what I discovered with the presentation is that Sex and the Supernatural, for the most part, is pretty dark. This is a presentation that's going to deal with everything from the ancient Greeks, the ancient Romans who believed that sex with the gods not only could happen but did happen, and was accepted as a normal part of society, to moving into the time period of the Middle Ages when sex was not only something that had a bad reputation, but was something that could actually get you killed, tortured, maimed. Everything revolved around sex, believe it or not. Everything, just like today, for the most part, we think we live in a society, a very hedonistic society, where sex is everywhere. Well, it's always been that way. It's just that sex hasn't always been accepted quite as easily as it is today. Because as I mentioned already, in the past, sex was the equivalent to the ages, the Church of the Middle Ages. It was a time of devils, demons, the Spanish Inquisition, and anything that even hinted at sex was seen as evil. For the most part, it was women who were evil during this time period. They still are, but it's not, just kidding. But that was how things were seen at the time. Women were the ones who led everyone to their downfall. That's why when the witch burnings and the tortures and the deaths of hundreds of thousands of people took place across Europe during the Middle Ages, most of those who died were women, because they were seen by the church as being the ones who caused these things to happen. Now, this is not a presentation that badmouths the church. It's just a presentation that really looks at the history of all of this stuff and explores how sex is connected to the supernatural. So we should get started here, and I want to begin with the times of the ancient Greeks. Now, the ancient Greeks believed in the sexual worship of their gods. They believed that having ritual orgies would bring about good luck and prosperity. Sex with the gods was something that was common, or was believed to be common. People claimed that they often had sexual experiences with their gods. In addition, they believed that having sex in honor of their gods could bring about good luck and prosperity. There was a time period when women made ritual trips to shrines to Aphrodite, and they would actually become temple concubines in her honor. They would actually come to the temple, and they would be paid to have sex with any man who came along, and all of the money would be given to the gods, given to the church. And this was seen as a very common practice. In fact, it was something that was seen as an honor, something that you would want to do for the gods. So it was one of those time periods when they believed that this was the best thing. Now, probably the one god who was most, besides Aphrodite, who was most connected to the sexual side of things in the Greeks, that was Dionysus, the god of wine, who believed in drunken sex orgies, or at least that's what his followers taught, which I'm sure was a great time for those who followed Dionysus. Now, one of the most popular sidekicks of Dionysus were the nymphs, who were, well, let's be honest, hot chicks who hung out in the woods and had sex with travelers, or at least that's how the stories went. People who would be traveling through, men who often claimed that they would run into these young women out here in the woods, or in this case, in this particular painting, they lived in a pond, and they would lure these travelers to the heights of sexual ecstasy. Now, probably one of the big sidekicks of the nymphs, or at least kind of the opposite side of them, were the satyrs. Now, the satyrs, like Pan, a lot of us are familiar with the god Pan, and they actually would pursue the nymphs for the most part. That was what they did for sport. But it wasn't just the nymphs that these particular gods would go after. They would really have sex with just about anything that walked. Man, woman, goat, you name it. They didn't really care. Now, the two most famous nymphs were, of course, Pan and Priapus. Now, I'm sure that that's a word that some of you may be familiar with because you've seen the Viagra commercials. People who end up with priapism, from the word Priapus, that means that you have an erection that lasts for more than 4 hours. And you're supposed to call your doctor, right? You're supposed to call your doctor, but you know the joke is, I'm not calling my doctor, I'm going to call everybody I know. So that's where the word comes from. It comes from the Greek, one of the Greek gods. Now, beyond the Greeks, as things progressed through out of the times of ancient Greece and before we got into the Middle Ages, in the early years, people became strong believers in sex magic. Now, there were two different types of sex magic. There were sexual acts that were aimed at achieving magical ends, and magical acts that were aimed at achieving sexual ends. In other words, sometimes people would have sex in hopes of conjuring up something or causing something to happen, but probably more common was magic that was aimed at sex, either making sex better or making sex worse. Let's say you put a curse on somebody and you decided that you didn't like this guy and you hated him, so a witch would put a curse on this person and cause a man to be unable to have sex. Or, in extreme cases, would cause his penis to fall off, which meant that you really made somebody mad. There were also spells that were cast to keep women from bearing children, to cause a woman to be unable to have sex. This was a common thing, and it was a very common belief that such things were possible. This was a time period when people were, I guess you would say, more in touch with the natural side of things. You see, this was seen as a natural side of the world. This was part of nature, they believed. It was a time period before the church began to gain ground in most of Europe. And in countries like England, Scotland, Ireland, it was very common for witches to be involved in all different types of sex magic. People come to them specifically for help or to cast curses on people. But often when we think of sex magic in a more modern era, coming into the late 1800s and early 1900s, we think of one man in particular, Aleister Crowley. Now, Aleister Crowley was a man who believed very strongly in sex magic. Groups like the Ordo Templi Orientis formed, and people like Aleister Crowley gained worldwide recognition for the orgies, the sex acts, and the things that they became involved in. Now Crowley became known as the wickedest man in the world, and many people have questioned whether or not he was the real deal or if he just loved attention. I've read everything I could get my hands on about this guy, and to be honest with you, I can't give you a clear explanation or an answer on it. I'm not sure what he was. There were many people who believed that Crowley was really a powerful person. Interestingly, for those who may be skeptical, you take a look at his life and take a look at the people who were connected to him most closely. People who lived with him, people who were his followers or worshipers, some of his wives. Numerous people in Crowley's life went insane, clinically insane, ended up in mental hospitals where they ended their last days. Now, could this have been because of the sheer kind of force of his personality? Could he have driven them to it? Or could he have been someone with some sort of power that had a dire effect on people who were close to him? Well, we'll never probably know for sure. But you know, Crowley, with his Order of the Golden Dawn, became known as an adventurer, an explorer, a drug addict, and, well, possibly a madman. We'll never know for sure, but he certainly made a mark on history. Now, prior to Crowley, back during the era directly after sex magic and nature and some of the other things we'll talk about in a few minutes began, we got into another kind of a darker form of worship. Now, this can only be tied into the rise of the church in the Middle Ages. As the church came into leaving Rome and moving out into other countries and across Europe, the church began to kind of force itself on the people who lived in the area. In this, usually ordinary people became part of the church almost by force because they just didn't know what else to do because of the way that things were put onto them. And there was a rebellion that came among the people toward the church in many cases. Now, not in every case, but when you get into talking about sex magic and you begin talking about the church and the things that happen, you can only look at the bright side for so long because things have got to turn to the darker side. And a lot of that rebellion came out as Satanism. Now, sex and Satanism and witchcraft have been tied together for centuries, mostly, as I said, because of the church. Whatever the church prohibited, Satanism embraced. It was a way for people to act out and do things. Now, the most recognizable form of Satanism to most of us today is, I like to call it LaVey Satanism, or the carnival Satanism. It's the kind that really doesn't worship the devil. You know, it doesn't have anything to do with an actual worship of Satan as a figure or a person or a being. It's really more of a way of life, I guess you would say. The idea behind Anton LaVey's form of Satanism, which he created in the 1960s, as, let's be honest, a good way to get attention, because he got onto the cover of every magazine, on television shows and newspapers, and became known all over the world as a former carnival showman who created his own religion, so to speak. by using parts of traditional Satanism and using a lot of stuff from Aleister Crowley, he became known as the guy who had the motto, do whatever you want to. Do what thou wilt. That was something that Crowley had invented. Anton LaVey embraced it and brought it to mass society. The idea was that you could do anything you wanted to as long as you didn't hurt somebody. As long as you weren't hurting anybody, it was okay. You were supposed to embrace the carnal side of your nature. That was what LaVey Satanism was all about. Now, for traditional Satanists, this is a pretty watered-down version of what they had in mind when Satanism was created. You see, the original Satanism that was created back in the Middle Ages was a way of really worshiping Satan as a being. It was the opposite of the Christian church. The devil was seen as a dark god. Black masses were held in his honor. Sexual orgies took place. Rituals took place. They actually took the Catholic Mass and they twisted it and turned it into something perverse. And that was the idea behind Satanism at the time. And as I said, it got its start in the Middle Ages. Now, it started off very innocently. It started off not worshiping dark gods, but worshiping the old gods. You see, when the Catholic Church first came into Europe, a lot of the people, the regular people, the peasants of the time, didn't like all the new rules they were being hit with. They didn't want to go to church. They didn't want to have to do all these things. They believed in the old gods. They believed that if you went out in the spring and you did a sacrifice, you brought food, you brought drinks, and let's say had an orgy in the middle of a clearing in the woods, it was going to be a good time for planting that spring because they'd done this in honor of the old gods. It was the nature gods. This is what they believed in. And this is what this is how they did their things. They would gather every month. They would have a feast, and they paid homage to their old gods. Now, when the Catholic Church came along, though, and became more repressive and became aware of the fact that the peasants were going out and having these orgies and these worship services, so to speak, these rituals, the Sabbaths that were taking place on a monthly basis, the church began prohibiting such things. Now, in the early days, when the church first came into England, into Europe, some of the priests back in those days, back before they had vows of celibacy, and that's so many of the priests were married. Many of the priests actually took part in the local Sabbaths that took place. But as things became more progressive or repressive, they began to discover that such things were forbidden. Now, it wasn't just the Sabbaths that were forbidden. For the most part, it was sex in general that was forbidden. Sex became a terrible thing. It was dirty, it was perverse, and as I said earlier, it was mostly blamed on women. So the only way that the church could really stop people from having sex was to guilt them into it. They made it so that only sex could only be carried out at certain times. Could only be done in the missionary position. All other positions were banned. You couldn't have sex in any other way. If a married couple, even a married couple, admitted to any other position during sex, they had to do penance for 7 years. So, yeah, talk about fun. But then, when that wasn't enough, they decided to regulate things even more. Intercourse became illegal on Sunday, Wednesday, and Friday, effectively removing 5 months out of the entire year when you could actually have sex. And this was for married people. If you were unmarried, forget it. It was none at all. You see, abstinence was required at certain times, even for married couples. Abstinence was required 40 days before Easter, 40 days before Christmas, and at least 3 days before accepting communion. Of course, when it was impossible for parishioners to hold these standards, the woman was always blamed for their downfall. So you went from already cutting out 5 months out of the year, by the time you cut out these other 40, you're down to just like a couple of months out of the year where it's actually allowed. Well, the people began to rebel. Not only did they hold on to the old ways and continue the Sabbaths, but they also began to, that was the beginning, really, of Satanism. It was all created mostly because of sex. Because Satanism was a way to rebel against this teachings of the church. It was a way to have sex anytime you wanted to, and just about whatever way you wanted to. Nobody cared. And This was what really led to the witchcraft trials of the 15th, 16th, and 17th centuries. When the church began to see that the people were rebelling and they were turning to what they considered to be the dark ways in their Sabbaths and in their worship of the old gods, they began arresting, torturing, and killing people who were accused of being witches. Now, most of these people were women, of course, because women were usually blamed for whatever happened in any situation, especially when it came to sex. And most of these women were the ones who were believed to be witches. They sought them out, they tortured them. There were hundreds of thousands of people died under torture. After being tortured for a while, let's be honest, you'd admit to just about anything. These were some of the devices that were used to torture and test people to see if they were witches. These situations, when you put somebody on the rack and begin stretching their body to the point that it's ready to snap, as I said, you'd admit to just about anything. Well, books began to fill, written by esteemed church leaders, of the confessions of the witches. Books that were written like the witch's hammer were written to tell priests and torturers how to actually extract confessions from witches. And they were brutal. They're unbelievable. And let me tell you something else. Every one of them revolves around sex. Women were stripped naked. They were tortured intimately. Hot pokers were put into just about every orifice of their body, trying to get them to confess to being witches. Most of the things, when you read some of these witchcraft trials and the accounts of the torture, it's like reading the Marquis de Sade. It's all revolves around sex, because here we had a bunch of undersexed priests and torturers and church officials who now had naked women at their disposal. And it was unbelievable and horrifying, the things that they did. Now, the witch hunt finally came to an end in the 1700s, including, we even had some of it go on here in our country as well, in Salem. I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with the witchcraft trials that took place there in the 1700s. And it was a situation where, as I said, thousands and hundreds of thousands of people died. All because it was believed that they could cast spells on people, that they could have diabolical influence over the minds and wishes of people who lived in their villages and communities. And often we think about this and we think that there's no way that anything like this could possibly happen in this day and age, right? Nobody would be accusing people of being witches or Satanists and putting them on trial for being Satanists and, let's say, abusing children and that kind of thing. Oh no, nothing like that could happen until the 1980s. A lot of you are going to remember the 1980s. You'll remember the satanic panic that ruled during that time when Satanists, thanks to people like Geraldo Rivera, Satanists were everywhere at that time. Geraldo Rivera had entire shows where they blamed Satanists for every missing person in the United States, claiming that they were carrying out ritual sacrifices of thousands of people every year. Of course, none of those bodies have ever turned up, but, they're out there, I'm sure. Geraldo says so, it must be true. Well, you also remember the McMartin preschool trial in the 1980s. Some of you might remember that. A guy who was accused of taking children into underground chambers beneath a daycare center in California and having ritual orgies and worshiping Satan with these little children after they, recovered their repressed memories. Well, not only did the people from the trial, the preschool go on trial for months and months and months. This thing went on. There wasn't even a basement in this building, let alone underground tunnels and chambers, and the whole thing was just a lot of just crazy talk that got inspired by a little book that came out in 1980 called Michelle Remembers. I'm sure some of you may have even read that book. I did. I read that book. I was a freshman in high school. I read that book, and it scared the living hell out of me, because I was sure there were Satanists waiting around every corner, waiting to kidnap us, torture us, and sacrifice us to Satan. Some of you may remember the history behind the story. There was a woman named Michelle Smith who had gone to see a psychiatrist because she was having a lot of issues. He began hypnotizing her and getting her to remember her repressed memories which usually all involved her mother taking her and giving her to Satan. Now, at some point during a long ordeal, when she was about 4 years old, she began remembering all these things about how Satan himself appeared, the Virgin Mary appeared, Jesus appeared to try to save her, and some really bizarre stuff, none of which there was any evidence of whatsoever. In fact, after the book came out, her father, who had been divorced from her mother who had died, actually came to the defense of the mother and explained none of these things could have possibly happened. Next door neighbors who knew her when she was at that age all claimed that none of those things could have happened, that they were around and aware of what was going on at the time. So this was a situation where repressed memories began making headlines, and these repressed memories became something that began to be seen as a terrible thing, especially after the McMartin preschool trial and that kind of thing, and they really have been debunked. But it just goes to show that when enough people start believing something, like with the witchcraft trials in the Middle Ages, that you never know what's going to happen. Now, we'll move on from Satanism and witchcraft on to demonic rapists, which is something that people will often bring up when you start talking about this stuff. In a situation like this, people began telling stories, and during the Middle Ages especially, there were entire volumes of accounts told by priests and by monks and travelers who claimed that they would spend the night in certain castles and would be in the middle of the night raped by demonic female women who would come and have sex with them. I'm not sure what they were complaining about, but they were, of course, morally offended by what was going on, and stories circulated that many of these demons were preying on women too. The succubus and the incubus were something that was a common part of the Middle Ages. Church officials believed that such cases were absolutely real and that they were absolutely taking place and that people were being raped on a regular basis. Now, these days, a lot of people will dismiss such stories, and they do come around. I still get stories from people who claim that they've been raped by ghosts. Some of you will remember the Entity case back in the 1970s. It was investigated by Kerry Gaynor and Barry Taff when they were both at UCLA, and they began telling stories. This woman was telling stories, believed her house was haunted, and believed that she was being raped by a ghost. They did record some pretty bizarre activity there, but for the most part, they came to believe that the activity was being caused by the woman, and it was poltergeist activity that she was creating with her own mind. But she truly believed she was being raped by some sort of spirit, and actually being held down by two other spirits who would kind of join in on the rape. Now, these days, most people refer to something like this as the old hag syndrome, or a waking dream, that people will believe they are being attacked or raped or assaulted in their sleep, and then when they wake up, they sometimes are unable to breathe, and they actually believe that there's a ghost or some sort of demonic figure having sex with them. This has become a common part of stories that you often hear, especially from the Middle Ages, and even up until today. People still tell stories about demonic rapes that occur. Now, in another supernatural aspect of history and connected to sex, you end up with possessions. There isn't a single story of possessions that don't have a sexual element to them somewhere. Almost every demonic possession case that you'll run across has something to do with sex. It'll usually start out with a young person who is around the age of puberty, who will begin having, will begin experiencing things that come to believe is demonic possession. One of the most famous cases took place in Iowa back in 1928, when a young woman was possessed by the spirit of her father, who had repeatedly tried to have sex with her when he was still alive. After he died, he continued to try and have sex with her, and in fact, she became demonically possessed and went through a pretty long ordeal of an exorcism that took place in a convent in Earling, Iowa. Even the famous St. Louis exorcism case does have some sexual elements to it. You'll often find it when you read through some of the accounts of the case, and That's one of the books I wrote was The Devil Came to St. Louis about that case. And there was a lot of sexual elements to the case, that many of which weren't even reported. I did some interviews with Father Halloran, who at the time was a seminary student who was involved in the exorcism. He told me some of the stories, some of the things that the young boy did that was allegedly possessed, with masturbation, urinating, a lot of the things that he said that never made it into the official record just because they were too shocking to be reported. Having sex with the Virgin Mary, that kind of things that he claimed he was going to do as he was speaking out, and may have been alleged, may have been possessed. So even that case had a lot of sexual elements to it. So that's become another thing that, when it comes to sex and the supernatural, is possession, demonic possession. Poltergeists are another thing that we often think of as having to do with sex, and they do. Poltergeist cases, as a lot of you guys know, I probably don't have to tell you too much about this. You're familiar with the idea that poltergeist activity often revolves around young women mostly, but often young men around puberty age who, as they're going through the pressures of puberty, begin acting out in a paranormal way. Things begin to move around them, doors open and close, lights turn on and off, things fly across the room, as you'll see in this photograph here. This is one of the photographs that was taken during the Columbus poltergeist outbreak in 1984. Fred Shannon, who worked for the Columbus paper at the time, house, and he was taking numerous photographs that were occurring at the time that the poltergeist outbreak was taking place around a young woman whose name was Tina Resch, who had been in the middle of not only puberty, but was having a lot of sexual and problem issues with a lot of her schoolmates and friends. And things began occurring in the Resch home. Items broke, doors opened and closed, lights set, a lot of electrical problems that couldn't be explained. And there was the activity that took place when Tina was sitting in the living room. Chairs would fly across the room. But Fred Shannon took this particular photograph of this telephone flying across Tina's lap. A lot of people tried to debunk the photograph, saying that it must have been thrown, that she must have done it herself. But Fred Shannon was there at the time, and he witnessed a lot of this stuff with his own eyes, as was Dr. William Roll. They were both present when a lot of the activity occurred. Now, toward the end of the outbreak, if you guys are familiar with the case at all, toward the end of the outbreak, it was believed that Tina was faking some of the activity to try to keep getting attention. She was an obviously very disturbed young woman. If you're familiar with what happened to her, she was accused of murdering her daughter, and she is still serving time in Georgia. She's in prison right now. And so she ended up with a pretty rough life after all of the media attention that she got back in 1984. Poltergeist cases are cases that we often think of as revolving around people, but there are instances where they may not be caused by the people, such as the case of the Bell Witch. Now, the story of the Bell Witch, of course, is one that is familiar with just about anybody who's familiar with ghost stories in American history. It's probably the most famous haunting in American history. Started back in 1817 when a ghost began preying on the Bell family in Tennessee. In fact, it's the only case in history that a ghost was actually said to be responsible for the death of one of the people involved in the case, and that was the death of John Bell. Now, a lot of people believe, myself included, that the spirit that haunted the Bell family was one that was an outside influence. It was a spirit that preyed on the family. But there are many who believe that it was just simply another poltergeist case, and they believe that it was one that was sexually motivated. Now, while absolutely no evidence exists to say that John Bell was raping his daughter Betsy, who was the other big target of the Bell Witch, that got started in the 1930s by a doctor named Nandor Fodder, who was a Freudian of the time, who, of course, you know the Freudians, it's never just a tunnel or a cigar, you know what I'm saying. So everything had to do with sex, and he was very Freudian influenced, and he believed that the so-called witch, he said, the spirit, was actually caused by Betsy Bell because her father was having sex with her, was raping her. And this incestuous relationship caused her to create a secondary personality that she was unaware of. And this secondary personality possessed psychic powers. and was able to cause things to fly about the house, noises, banging sounds, breaking glass, injuries to people, even to Betsy herself, who would often be beaten and slapped by things that would occur in the house. So that's one of the things that many people have pointed to as one of the explanations for the Bell Witch. It's not one that I necessarily believe, but it is one that I did feel like I should point out because, again, it's a case that even the most famous case in American history has to do with sex. Now, we're going to get into another area now where it gets away from demonic rapists, where people were being attacked or possessed by ghosts against their will. And we're going to get into a situation where people wanted to be possessed by ghosts. And of course, that's the spiritualist movement that began back in the middle part of the 1800s, when mediums would actually ask the ghosts to come into them and possess them and cause them to do things. Usually, spiritualism, if you don't know much about it, is a belief that people can and do communicate with the dead. And that communication comes through these mediums who would invite the spirits to come in, possess them, to speak through them, cause things to occur through them. Now, one of the interesting things about spiritualism was that it came about during one of the more repressive times in modern history, which was the Victorian era, when people didn't talk about sex. In fact, women never left the house and would expose their ankles, let alone talk about sex. It was just something that you just didn't do. And it was considered to be the improper thing. So when spiritualism came about, suddenly these young women who were acting as mediums in many of these situations had an outlet for all this sexual repression that was being forced on them. Because, well, you could do just about anything you wanted if you were a medium. Well, it wasn't your fault. The spirits made you do it. No, that's why you took off all your clothes. That's why you performed seances naked. That's why you walked around the room and sat on the laps of all the single men who happened to be at your seance because, well, the spirits made you do it. So it's okay. This was a time period or a movement that actually made it possible for the first time in history for women to become actual leaders of a movement because they were, for the most part, not every case, but in the most part, they were the mediums. They were the ones in charge and causing these things to happen. So they were seen at a higher level of society than they'd been given for hundreds of years prior to that. So spiritualism really changed history, at least the sexual history that we know of today. Now, many of the records, what's interesting, you read some of the records and some of the stories about the seances that occurred back during the height of the spiritualism era, and you'll find that the writers, the men who were reporting these things, who were writing about these cases, you'll find that they often didn't want to refer to things exactly as they were. They would refer to, let's say, a medium who is performing a seance that's tied to a chair, causing ectoplasm to appear. If you're familiar with ectoplasm, it's that slimy gunk that's supposed to come from the spirit world and would take shapes and do things and appear at different times during seances. And they would mention that, let's say that a medium caused ectoplasm to appear. Well, let's just say it didn't always come from your mouth or your nose or your ears. And sometimes this stuff would appear and the writers would say, well, the ectoplasm appeared above her stockings. It's a little vague, but that's the kind of reporting that they did at the time. They didn't really want to make a big point about, exactly what was going on. But there was a lot of sex going on at the seances that didn't make it into the official literature. Sometimes they would refer to things and hint around about them, as I mentioned. Sometimes it would be about the mediums themselves. This young man, whose name was Willie Schneider, was a famous medium during the late 1800s and the early 1900s. And Willie Schneider eventually got into trouble, but in the early days of his mediumship, he was believed to be, by even some of the more skeptical people of the day, like Harry Price, was believed to be a genuine medium. And Willie Schneider would get very hot and bothered during his seances. As things would begin to appear, messages would come through, knocking sounds would be heard. He had a tendency to, I'm trying to think of nice ways to say some of this stuff. He had a tendency to rub himself on other people at the seances, usually men who were at the seances. Some of the scientists who witnessed the seances and wrote about them, needless to say, were pretty uncomfortable when sitting too close to Willie. My guess would be after a while, they would form a circle and Willie would be on one side of the table by himself, would be my guess, because nobody wanted to sit too close. Because he had a tendency to get very excited while the seance was going on. He wasn't the only one. Probably the most famous oversexed medium of the Victorian era in the early 1900s was Eusapia Palladino, who, as you can see from this photograph, was one hot babe. She was an Italian peasant woman who became a medium early on in life, but didn't really achieve much fame until she was in her 50s. Around the early part of the 1900s, she began really surprising a lot of the scientists from that era who were studying spiritualism, and they were finding that she was doing some pretty amazing things at some of her seances. Photographs that were taken at the time, it's a little tough to see here in the photograph if you don't know what's going on, but that table that you see there is about 1.5 feet off the floor. It was one of the, and I've seen other photographs with tables up in the air, flying across the room. She did often some pretty amazing things at some of her seances. She also had a habit or reputation for cheating. If she couldn't get things to happen, she'd fake it. And then usually real things would start to occur. Now, the British kind of got this. They understood that this is what was happening, and they would excuse her cheating. Her career really ended, though, when she came to America to put on one of her seances, one of her shows, and she got caught by some of the American scientists cheating, and they discredited her and sent her back to Europe. But for a long time, she gained quite a reputation. Now, in addition to being able to perform some pretty amazing stuff at her seances, she also gained another kind of reputation for becoming, like Willie, very hot and bothered during her seances. Now, she would often say that as she was working with the spirit world, she would become very aroused, which probably worked for her in Italy. Nobody really cared that this kind of large woman was climbing all over people at seances. And when I say climbing all over people, I'm talking about lifting up her dress and trying to mount people who were in the audience, men in the audience. This didn't fly in England in the early 1900s. The scientists who were investigating spiritualism in England at the time were the upper class of society. They were the upper crust. And many of them were actually royalty who were involved in investigating spiritualism, and they'd heard these great things about Eusapia Palladino, so they invited her over to England one summer to do some sessions for them so that they could study what she was doing in her seances. And about the first time she hiked up her dress and climbed on the lap of one of Sir whatever his name was, kind of thing, the wives were not happy, and neither were the men. This just wasn't something you did in Victorian England. And they were very uncomfortable with Eusapia Palladino. But her reputation and her lack of sexual inhibitions kind of followed her for a number of years. Eventually, she just sort of faded into obscurity, and that really became an end to her career. But as far as American mediums go, there is no more famous hot medium, I guess you would say, than a woman whose name was Marjorie. Mina Crandon was a young woman from Boston who gained worldwide, really, recognition for her seances, mostly for her ongoing duel with the magician Harry Houdini. Marjorie came along at an interesting time in the 1920s. After World War I, there was a new upsurge in interest in spiritualism. The Great War was the first time that the world had really seen massive casualties, dead soldiers, dead young men in a war situation. And because of the sheer loss of life, people became interested in spiritualism and in communicating with the dead. Well, Marjorie came along in the 1920s at a time period that was spiritualism was at its height. It was getting publicity in regular newspapers, in regular magazines. And Scientific American, the esteemed Scientific magazine, probably the most esteemed in American history, decided to offer a contest where they would offer a cash award to any medium who could prove that they were genuine. They put together a committee to investigate these claims, and one of the members of the committee was the magician Harry Houdini, who was well known for debunking fake mediums. He believed that the prize from Scientific American would never be claimed because he didn't believe that he would ever run across a genuine medium, no matter how badly he wanted to. Houdini was obsessed with communicating with his dead mother and had visited thousands of mediums, hoping that one of them would prove to be genuine. He'd yet to find one. Well, the investigating committee went on for some time, usually debunking whatever medium came to sit for them. Finally, Houdini couldn't keep sitting around with a non-paying job, and he went back on his book tour. He had a book he put out, and he was on doing magic shows and doing a debunking of spiritualism show. And he went back out on tour, and while he was on tour, he happened to catch a newspaper headline that said that the Scientific and American Committee had found a genuine medium, and they were getting ready to award Marjorie, which her stage name, her real name was Mina Crandon. They were going to award Marjorie the prize. Well, Houdini was livid, mostly because of the gigantic size of his ego, and he believed that there was no way that the committee could have actually investigated without him there. And so he took it upon himself, along with the editor of the magazine. They decided that they were going to travel to Boston, where Houdini could have some private sittings with Marjorie on his own so that he could see exactly what was going on. So Houdini traveled to Boston, got involved in a series of seances with Marjorie, and in the end, well, let's just say it was a draw, because both of them accused the other one of sabotaging the seances. Houdini believed she was faking it. Marjorie believed Houdini had done something so that she could not actually cause her abilities to work. And so the two had an ongoing public battle for quite some time. In the end, I guess you would say that Houdini won because the cash award was never rewarded. And so Marjorie never got the title of being America's only genuine medium. Houdini's career never suffered from it. He went on to even greater heights of fame until his death. Marjorie actually even went on to some fame for quite some time. A couple things you need to know about Marjorie and the Houdini situation, though. You see, Marjorie had gained her reputation as a great medium from the people who came to visit her, who came to her sittings to see what she had to offer. Marjorie, when she would greet these visitors at the door to her home, would usually greet them wearing lingerie and would invite them into her, usually men, into her parlor so that she could put on her seance, which she did in the nude. So being completely naked, nobody was really paying that much attention to what was going on in the room. When things were flying around and items were moving around, nobody was really paying any attention to, let's say, the man behind the curtain, because they didn't care because, well, there was a naked woman in front of them, and that's all they really cared about. When Houdini showed up in Boston to conduct his investigation, he discovered that the members of the committee were actually living with the Crandons at their home in Boston. They were actually living in the house. At least 3 of them had fallen in love with Marjorie, and it was rumored that she was having sex with 4 of the committee members. So not surprisingly, she was America's most genuine medium. Nobody really cared at that point. Well, Houdini exposed all of that probably for what it was. But when things were over, when the Houdini publicity had all died down, Marjorie continued on with her career. She had already had a reputation. She had a lot of followers who were interested in what she was doing already. But she gained another reputation in the years after the Houdini situation, and that was for creating ectoplasm. She became very well known for ectoplasm that would take shapes: hands, feet, faces. It would actually come out of her body and would take form. And it was often photographed by some of the investigators who came to see her seances using what really qualified as infrared photography at the time. They were actually photographing this ectoplasm appearing. I think probably some of you already know where I'm going with this, because Marjorie's ectoplasm always appeared from one particular orifice. There was a reason she did all of her seances naked, because she needed a way to cause the ectoplasm to, let's say, find its way freely to the air. And this stuff was photographed. Now, when it was, I'm going to show you next, right? This is what everybody waited for in Oklahoma for like an hour, because I hinted at what I had for my last couple of photos, and so no one left the room. But I will tell you that they were at least somewhat modest, because they were photographing it. But the next two photographs are photographs that were taken during one of Marjorie's seances, and when she was causing her ectoplasm to appear. Now, this was a glob of ectoplasm that had appeared from, let's just say, underneath that handkerchief, and ended up lying there on her stomach. And I don't know, it looks like somebody needs to go to the doctor, to me. But this photograph is another one showing the same thing, this time covered up, again, with a handkerchief. But this item has oozed out over, again, disgusting, over the top of the handkerchief. And people were pretty impressed by this. Yeah, don't ask me where I get this stuff either. You don't want to know. But yeah, so this was Marjorie's, I guess you would say, what she was known for. She eventually deteriorated into, became an alcoholic, and eventually kind of faded into oblivion. But there for a while, she got some attention, not only from Houdini and the Scientific and American Committee, but also from the people who followed her career in the years afterward. So just to sort of wrap things up, you can see how closely connected some of this stuff is. Sex and death and the supernatural have gone hand in hand from the very beginning, all the way back to the ancient Greeks, through the Middle Ages, and of course up until today. Because, well, when you knew what like I said, I think except for the drawings, this is as full as I've seen the auditorium. I don't think you would have cared who was speaking. All you saw was the subject matter, and people pile in because people are interested. They want to see how it all connects. How does it all connect in your life? That's entirely up to you. But let me tell you that in the years that I've been involved in this field, this is our 13th conference, and in the years that I'm involved in this field, I find that, and if you're offended by this, I'll apologize in advance, but I won't mean it. I found that the ghost community and I've been involved in lots of different groups and communities over the years. I've known a lot of different people. Except for some friends of mine that are bikers, I've found that the most oversexed community of anybody I've ever been involved with has been the ghost people. And hey, it's the truth. And I think by the time we all make it out to the hotel tonight, I think you'll see what I mean. But it's a good group of people. It's a great group of people, and I've always had a great time with everybody I've been involved with in the community over the years. And but it's something that we're all fascinated with. We're fascinated with the supernatural. Everybody is fascinated with sex, whether you're fascinated with the supernatural or not. This is just a group of people who tends to combine those two things. So, keep that in mind about how all connected all this stuff is. And, hopefully if you didn't get a copy of the book, you'll pick it up at some point in the future. I think you'll like it. Like I said, it's much more in depth than I could possibly do in an hour. But it's not happy, light reading. So it's one of those kind of dark things. So I'll warn you about that ahead of time. But anyway, thank all of you guys. Thank you, all of you, for sitting there and giving such attention for the last hour or so. We are going to be taking a break now until 2:30. I think 2:30.